Welcome back to episode 2 of the To Be a Boy podcast. And I think we need to start with a thank you, Joeli.
I mean, what a response. It's been incredible. We're so grateful. Thank you, everybody that's tuned in and listened. I think it's even astounded us, hasn't it, for how many listeners we've had.
I mean, I thought people would like it, hence why we're doing it. But actually, people really love it. So thank you. It has given us so much confidence and motivation to bring you more amazing episodes. And Apple said we have the number one podcast for parenting in the UK last week, which mind blowing. So thank you, everybody, for the love and support. Really, really appreciate you.
I guess the timing of it is, couldn't really be better in many ways, because as we've seen in the news this week, things are getting pretty hairy out there, aren't they? So you've got Trump wanting to get into bed, for want of a better word, with Andrew Tate, which I don't know about you, but makes me feel physically sick in every way. Actually, the fact that I phrased it as getting into bed with Andrew Tate probably didn't help the feeling of wanting to vomit. You've got the rollback of diversity and inclusion policies. Goldman Sachs and Deloitte have both said they're going to sunset the diversity and inclusion policies. What else has gone on this week that's been horrendous?
So much.
So I did a post this week on LinkedIn because I've been reflecting quite a lot about the fact that I'm leaving pregnant and screwed. And it's been 10 years. And I was thinking about what my inspiration was for starting it. Now, obviously, I got pushed out of my job when I was pregnant, which, was a pretty big trigger. But I also know that a big inspiration for me was Nana Cherry. When I was 9 years old, I loved Top of the Pops, loved Nana Cherry. Probably my first love, I would say. And she came bounding out onto the stage in her high-top trainers and a big medallion necklace. I think she was 7 months pregnant at the time, singing Buffalo Stance, which is still one of my favourite pop songs ever. I can do the rap
Tune.
If you give me a few drinks. Big tune. And I remember sitting looking at her, and back in those days, Elliot,
In those days,
you just didn't see pregnant women on the TV. And even if you saw them out in the wild, they were wearing like a tent. That's just, there was you didn't really show your pregnancy bump. It wasn't something that you were particularly proud of. You sort of hid away. And I was absolutely agog that this incredibly beautiful, achingly cool woman was bouncing around on stage 7 months pregnant. And it obviously really resonated with me that she was like, I can fulfill my dreams and I can have a baby. I can do all of this and you aren't going to tell me otherwise. And I was listening back then to Nana Cherry after, reflecting on this and listening to Man Child. Now, you will maybe remember that. Man
I know that song.
Child. And I have had a number of boyfriends. That sounds
What kind
terrible.
of podcast is this, Joeli? This is in the kids and family section?
Just one or two, not that many. But I have had, more than one boyfriend who I would say has Peter Pan syndrome. They just never wanted to grow up. And it seems to be a particular thing amongst some men. And I don't know women like that. I only know men like that. So I wanted to ask you what you thought about
That's me.
men with
Well, first of all,
Peter Pan syndrome.
can we get Nina Cherry on the podcast, please?
Oh, hell yeah.
Nina Cherry, if you're listening, hit us up, okay, to beaboyteam@gmail.com. We'll be from the podcast.
I don't think I'd be able to speak. I'd just do the Buffalo Stance rap at her and then die inside because...
But no, seriously, serious question. Big question. Yeah, I've seen this too, and I think there's a couple of reasons. The first one, I think, is quite easy to talk about, and the second one isn't easy to talk about. So let's start with the first. I think for a lot of men, as we're going to explore through this podcast, don't necessarily know how to. I was doing a webinar a couple of years ago now, and I was asking people around men's mental health, why don't men speak about their mental health as much as they could and should? And one man said, I've never done it before. I wouldn't know where to start. And he explained that he's never, ever had a conversation about his well-being with anyone, really, he wouldn't know how to begin that conversation. And he was a big man, right? So I think there is this idea that we haven't necessarily practiced how to do it. We haven't been in spaces and friendship groups that have encouraged us to do so. And, underpinning that is all the kind of ideas about gender norms, right? That men don't show their emotions, boys don't show their emotions. And sometimes we say to boys, don't cry, and then we get surprised when they're 30, 40-year-olds and don't know how to express themselves. So I think that's probably a big part of the reason. Is that what you think as well?
I definitely think there is an issue with men talking about their feelings, and the men that I am thinking about would not be very good at expressing their emotions and how they felt.
So I actually asked Snenny, my wife, yesterday. I said, "Do you think I'm open about my emotions?" She said, "Yeah, I think so." But it's taken me a while, to be honest. I think when we first met, I wasn't as open. I wouldn't admit so many vulnerabilities. Now I think I'm more comfortable and secure in who I am. And I have noticed for a lot of men, when they feel that they're accomplished, it's then okay to be vulnerable. So there's kind of a shield around you. I can talk about my mental health challenges because I feel like I'm successful. So within my vulnerability, there's a shield there. Whereas I don't know if I would be so open about some of my challenges if I didn't feel secure in where I was in my life right now. And so you do feel like sometimes men will talk up after the fact, when they've been through something, they've come out the other end and it's all good. But talking about it as you're going through it and really showing that vulnerability, I think that's quite difficult. The second reason I think some men don't talk, and this is uncomfortable, and this is a challenging conversation. I do hear some men say that they have tried to be vulnerable with their partner and that hasn't been received very well. And this is tricky because I think when we think about some men who have potentially been stoic in their relationship, they've been the rock, they've never shown any vulnerability ever. And maybe their partners appreciated that trait in them. For that person to turn around and say they're upset or say they're struggling or say they're finding something difficult and they can't lead in this moment or they don't know what to do, that can be uncomfortable for the man, but it can also be uncomfortable for the woman as well. And I think when we look at patriarchy and the gender norms, we're all a product of that, and where it's uncomfortable for some men to speak up, I think it's also uncomfortable for some women to hear their partner in that vulnerable state as well.
I think some women also perpetuate the patriarchy as much as men do in many ways. And we try and fulfill those stereotypes, many of us, as much as, men do. So we feel able to be vulnerable. And when a man is vulnerable, it messes with those stereotypes. And so we find it challenging. I can imagine that is the case, that in relationships, there will be situations where men show vulnerability and women are like, oh, what is this? I didn't want that from you. Yeah. And that will create new barriers for men.
It does. So I've done kind of workshops where we ask everyone how they can be allies to men. And often I'll ask the question, and a lot of it that comes back is create open spaces for conversation, like facilitate those conversations, learn how to be really good listeners, understand our own emotional response when someone cries in front of us. And that can be deep work and really difficult because we've got to unpack like how we feel about how that person should show up. And when they don't necessarily show up in a way that we're used to, not a wrong way, but a way that we haven't come accustomed to, that can be quite challenging. And sometimes, we can get a bit hot and blood pressure goes up and we don't know how to respond. And then that person can feel that. And then they think, oh, actually, I'm not going to do that again because that wasn't received well. And so the kind of cycle continues. So I think it's a conversation to be had. And, I hope that's received with love from everybody because it's sensitive. And I'm definitely not saying that women are to blame for men not opening up. I think it is 100% the responsibility of men to lead and own their emotions and do the work. Yeah. But I think at the same time, we can also understand the system and the environment that we're living in and understand it's not about blame. It's just the reality that not everyone is comfortable with men showing vulnerability.
Fully put. So
Thank
listen,
you, Joeli.
we've got a cracking episode coming up, haven't we? And we're going to start. It's Ruth Whippman who wrote the book Boy Mom. We are going to start a Ruth Whippman fan club because, my God, this woman is brilliant. Like, you're going to love this episode. And we'd also really like to thank our sponsors, Bubble and Movember, who are giving us support. And we couldn't do this podcast without them. So thank you, Bubble and Movember.
You are a massive Ruth fan. I mean, is that a Ruth poster you have on your wall, Joeli, behind you? I can see.
I've got her tattoo, a face tattooed on my chest. I've just gone the whole way, Elliott, because I love that woman. I haven't had a full woman crush for a long time, but Ruth, you've got me.
She was great. And I think it's a great first guest to have, actually, because a lot of what she says really sets the tone for the whole podcast.
Yeah.
So it's an amazing first guest. And thank you, Ruth. There's so many nuggets, so many gems, so much wisdom that she brought to the conversation.
So enjoy, everybody.
Enjoy.
Today we are joined by Ruth Whippman, who is the author of Boy Mum, Raising Boys in the Age of Toxic Masculinity. She is British and lives in the United States with her husband and 3 sons. Boy Mum is an exploration of the specific challenges experienced by boys and how feminist mums might navigate their conflicting and complex feelings. I certainly nodded along to every single word in this book, whilst being astounded by some of the data and stories that Ruth shares. Ruth starts the book by talking about the pitiful looks and comments she would get when she said she was having a 3rd son, and how since Me Too and Donald Trump and Harvey Weinstein, it has felt like everywhere she turned, there was another example of a bad man. From incels to masculinity influencers to men's rights activists to Greg Wallace, the list goes on. She understood, of course, why there was so much anger directed at men, but as a mother of 3 sweet boys, it was impossible to see men as the enemy. She sets out to ask a question. Is there a way to offer real empathy to boys, to give them a more expansive story about their own possibilities, without betraying any feminist principles? Ruth, welcome to Be a Boy. It's such a pleasure to have you here.
It's so great to be talking to you. Thank you.
I mean, firstly, I've got it here and it is dog-eared. I have highlighted, I have folded things over. I absolutely loved this book so much. And honestly, I've wanted this book for a really long time, and I've thought about that. I'm sure you feel the same, which is why you wrote it. And I did think to myself, maybe one day, I'll do a bit of research and I'll write a book about that. But thank God you did, because it's so much better than anything I could have written. It is packed. It's honestly, it's funny. It's packed full of facts and data. You look at all the different angles from every different angle that you could possibly look at it. And I found it completely captivating. So thank you for writing it.
Well, that's really lovely to hear. Thank you so much.
So we want to get right into it because, as I said to you earlier, we could do 24 podcasts based just on this work. And so we want to maximise our time while we've got you. In the book, you say some stuff about boys which I found tremendously validating. And one of those being that baby boys actually may need more nurture than baby girls, and that their brains are behind baby girls when they're born, and they develop in a different order to baby girls. Parts of their brain that are responsible for emotional and self-regulation and impulse control develop up to 2 years later in boys compared to girls, which I found absolutely fascinating. So can you tell us a bit more about that research you uncovered in relation to hormones as well and the impact they have on boys?
Yeah, so all this nature-nurture stuff is really interesting. And it's kind of quite fraught because, sometimes when you sort of talk about how much is innate and how much is socialized, it can feel like you're making some kind of political statement. And so I went into that research with a lot of trepidation. And, there's this whole story about boys will be boys. And it's like the idea, when you hear that, you kind of imagine that boys are like sort of innately aggressive or destructive or really sturdy and tough and, not very vulnerable. But what I found when I looked at the research was actually almost the complete opposite, that a baby boy is actually more emotionally sensitive and fragile and vulnerable than a baby girl at birth. And the reason for that is that the right hemisphere of the brain, which is the part, it's very easy to oversimplify, but broadly speaking, the right part of the brain is the part that deals with emotions, emotional self-regulation, so like calming down if you're upset, and forming attachments and relationships. So it's like your emotional center. In a baby boy, that's about a month to 6 weeks behind a baby girl in development at birth. And if you know newborns, you know that a month to 6 weeks is really quite a lot. Like if you think about premature babies or whatever. And so when a boy is born, he's like a little bit more, the boys tend to cry more often. They find it harder to calm down. They're more kind of upset by traumatic or difficult events. So if they're separated from their caregiver or, if something goes wrong, you can see that a baby boy takes slightly longer to calm down. Obviously, we're talking about averages here, group averages. Every individual is different. And a baby girl is generally slightly more independent, slightly more resilient. So you can see that in the data that pretty much every bad thing that can happen to a baby, so whether that's like abuse or neglect or poverty or postnatal depression from the mom, all of these things have a bigger impact on boys than they do on girls. And you can see data on that carries all the way through life, that boys are more vulnerable to disruption. And that kind of brain vulnerability, it's brain immaturity and brain vulnerability carries on throughout childhood. So boys' brains just develop more slowly. And I think we tend to, our stories about gender make us sort of see boys as much tougher and sturdier, and that they may be not as emotionally complex as girls and that kind of thing. But actually, if anything, they're more in need of that extra support, that extra nurture. And because of our ideas about gender, we actually end up treating baby boys a little differently than baby girls. We think they're tougher, we think they're sturdier, we throw them around more. We don't give them quite such nurturing care as we give baby girls. So they need a little more and they get a little less. And that ends up adding up to quite a big difference over time.
I just wanted to clarify on one of the points you said, because I can imagine some boys or men that might be listening will be thinking, hold on, our brains are not behind girls. But it's not about intelligence, is it?
Right.
It's about
right.
order. Yeah.
Yes. It's not about intelligence at all. So cognitive skills. And this is, I think, why this issue becomes really controversial, because people get hung up on these, like, who can read maps and who can do maths and who can do, reading and everything. Actually, cognitively, in terms of like intelligence, boys and girls' brains are really similar. They have very similar IQs. But it's the emotional development, the sort of emotional and attachment development, that's the bit that is a little bit behind. And the parts that deal with like self-regulation, so calming down, impulse control, that sort of thing. It's those things which are different.
And I know that you said that baby boys are they're bathed in testosterone when they're in the womb as well. How do hormones play a role as well in their behaviour?
Yeah, so it's interesting this, because again, this is quite controversial, because when they're kids, boys and girls, like pre-puberty, boys and girls actually have similar levels of testosterone when you measure them. But when baby boys are in utero, in the womb, they get this kind of testosterone influx. And that has been connected to more like what they call rough and tumble kind of play later in life. And you can see it in other species as well. So in rats and in primates and everything, that male infants and male children tend to play in a more physical, in a more rambunctious way than female infants. And again, group level differences. There will, everyone's going to know a really, really active girl and a really, really quiet and sedate boy. So there is a lot of variation, but at a group level, boys tend to play in a more physical and more rambunctious way.
All my two boys do is punch each other in the face and play with their own penises. That has been my life for the last 11 years. And I know, reading your book, you said you were living my life, and with every page I was like, yes,
Well, because I grew up with that version of feminism that's like, boys and girls are only different because we socialize them differently. And, it was almost like a point of principle that it's all about socialization. So I went into parenting. I was so like full of, kind of full of myself, honestly. I was like, my boys are going to be different. They're not going to be badly behaved. I'm not going to let them get away with all this like behavior and all of this. And then, of course, I was like blindsided. My boys were the most like rough and tumble, the most wrestling, the most penis grabbing, the most like all of the things. They like the Nerf guns the most, and it felt like reading this research actually felt quite validating for me as a mum, because I think we have this idea that we have so much control over how our children turn out, and that every decision we make is going to have this huge impact down the line and all the rest of it. And I think there was something about knowing that, when I saw my neighbours' little girls who were like colouring in nicely and, and sitting at a restaurant and being all sweet and playing nicely with their dolls, it was a little bit validating to say, look, it's not all you. You can't, there are things you can do, and there's a lot that parenting matters in a big way, but it's not like all you. You don't have so much control.
I found with my daughter, so my eldest is 9. And interesting, when she's playing with my wife, she's happy to sit down and colour and read. When it's daddy, she wants to like beat me up and climb on my head. And it's nice, but sometimes I want to chill and read a book as well. What do you think about that? Yeah, I just want to relax sometimes. I can't. So what is it because have I modeled that to her? Maybe I've been more physical, and I probably was when she was younger, so she's picked that up from me.
Yeah, I think kids in general like look to their parents for different things, and there's all this research that shows that dads behave really differently than moms. Like the way that dads interact with kids is really different, and they are more physical with them. Dads tend to roughhouse and like play in that more physical way, and so she probably is taking cues at some level. She's like, oh, daddy's the one who's going to be the like fun bumptious one. And I know as a mom I see it the other way around, which is like dad's always the fun one. It's like he gets labelled the fun one, and I'm always like the boring chores, nurture one. But, so it kind of cuts both ways. But I like hearing it from a dad's point of view, that you're just like, oh, let me just be the one who sits
I want to be the boring
book.
parent sometimes. Like on a Sunday when I'm knackered, and
you don't want to be like...
I see them having a great time sitting down on the sofa. And then when we take turns, so it's my turn now, and I don't get to sit down on the sofa. So I want to be more boring. I'm going to work on being more of the boring parent. I think that's my future. That's my future.
Love that. Be more boring. I love that.
More boring.
My kids have been loving watching Flash recently, the series, and I get really excited when I see the women in Flash go in for a fight, and they'll like take on the baddie, and they'll be really badass and, kick them to the ground. And internally I'm like, come on, lasses, you can do it. But what I really took away from your book, which I found really interesting, was that the overall message, one of the overall messages, because there is a number, was that we're asking girls to be more like boys in this strive for gender equality, but we're not asking boys to be more like girls. We're asking boys to be boys and girls to be more like boys. Yeah. Could you talk a bit about that?
Yeah, I mean, like if you go into the bookshop, every book that has the word girl in the title will somehow have the word like mighty or superhero or like Supreme Court Justice here in America or scientist or whatever it is. But you don't see so much of a push to get boys to embrace more feminine coded things. So like, nurturing or nursing or caregiving or relationships or whatever. And, especially when it comes to friendships, there's all these stories for girls about friendships and relationships, and you really don't see any push to have more stories like that for boys, or barely. And the reason is, I think it comes down to, it's sexism. It's like we value masculine things higher. We value things associated with boys and men more highly than we do value things associated with girls and women. So if a girl is going to act more like a boy, we see it as this like aspiration. It's like a promotion for her. It's like, you've achieved something. Well done. You're more like a boy, be anything a boy can be. But for a boy to behave more like a girl, it's still seen as like this like humiliating like demotion. It's like a step down for him. And we still have internalized that, run like a girl, throw like a girl, act like a girl. It's a bad thing. And so I think we have to ask ourselves as a culture, what do we really value? And I think those sort of feminine coded things are actually things that are really important for boys and girls, you know, relationships, nurturing, empathy, caregiving. They're things that are so important to living a good, healthy, valuable life. And if we don't value those, and if we tell boys that these things are worthless and stupid and girly and all the rest of it, then we're not just devaluing girls and women, we're devaluing these like crucial values and skills.
Yeah.
And so we need to think about what we really value, I think.
And that goes into the workplace as well. You know, I think for ages we've done women development programs, and part of that has been to display what you call more masculine traits, rather than also working with the men to help them to be caregivers, to have more empathy, and better listeners, and those kind of things too. And a lot of my work is trying to work with men to introduce those aspects of life and understand how that's important for the workplace, but just themselves as human beings, their own longevity and well-being. When I was looking at the research for this, I was thinking about romantic conquests. And I've found that I think a lot of parents, in my experience, parents of boys will tend to celebrate their sons' romantic conquests. You know, you've got a girlfriend. They're really. I've seen it with my own daughter. It's quite disturbing. And I found that with parents of girls, they don't do the same thing. They don't necessarily encourage their young 9, 10-year-old girls to seek a boyfriend. Have you found that in regards to how parents kind of maybe push their own ideas of the hunter in a relationship onto their children?
Even that word conquest. I mean, you'd never talk about a conquest of a young girl like, oh, you conquered your boyfriend. You know, it's just that word. I think everything for boys, we tend to frame in terms of like battles and heroism and winning and competition. And so like girls, you know, there's something really icky about that, isn't there? It's like a conquest of a girl. It's not really seeing her as a human being that you're making a like connection with as person to person, and seeing her as a fully developed human. It's like something that you win as a prize, you know, and the actual person involved is really incidental. And I think that's a really sexist, sort of misogynistic message. And you're right that with girls, you know, in some ways, we kind of overemphasize relationships for girls. So there's this idea that, but maybe when they're a bit older, so it's this idea that you're nothing without a man, you're nothing without a husband, you know, you can't be doing it on your own. You know, that's maybe a sort of slightly older story, but we do, you know, girls like play bride and they dream about their weddings, and then they meet up with boys who have been taught to see relationships as these kind of winning and conquest things. And so, you know, there's a real like mismatch of expectations when they actually do have relationships when they're older. And the other thing is that, you know, when they're teenagers, I think we like really overemphasize like sex for boys in a way. It's like it's sort of like they're only interested in one thing. They're only interested in like in sex and like conquests and all the rest of it. And girls are only really interested in love. And I think it kind of tends to like underestimate like girls' desire, girls' sexual drive, girls' need for pleasure. And also, when it comes to boys, underestimate their very real need for love and connection. You know, every boy, I interviewed so many boys for the research for Boy Mum, you know, from like 15, 16 through like college age. And I thought they'd be like, oh, all I care about is sex. And that was not the case at all. Every single one of them was like in love with somebody, you know, talking about how much they love, you know, their crushes and the girls or boys or whatever that they were in love with, you know, and it was just, I don't think we give them permission to be fully human in that way.
Did you recall you saying in the book that there is research that shows that boys and girls want intimacy equally, that they both want intimate, meaningful relationships, but, you know, we don't perceive it that way.
Yeah. And what was really interesting was that it's both for like romantic relationships, but also friendships. Like this was the biggest thing that kept coming across through all the conversations I had with boys, is that they wanted like deeper, more intimate connections with their male friends, but they felt like they couldn't have them. They felt like it was shameful to be vulnerable. Like one boy described his friendship group as a very unsupportive support system. So it was like they all had fun, they hung out, they talked about, you know, video games and sports and whatever it was, and memes and that kind of thing. But they really felt like they couldn't share their deeper, more vulnerable selves. And in a way, they just weren't modeled that. They weren't taught to do it. So partly it was like this shame around it, and partly they just didn't even know how. They were like, where would I even start? Like, how would I even identify it in myself to even start to tell it to another person? And that's really sad. That's not what they wanted. They really wanted it to be different, but they were just like, I don't know where to start with this.
And it's so sad that that continues into adulthood. You know, so a lot of my work with men, one of the big things that come out of that is lack of friendships, is loneliness. They may have acquaintances, people they go to the football with, they see at the school gates, but they can't go to when shit hits the fan. They haven't got that intimacy. And we talk quite a lot about the differences in general in some male and female friendship groups. And there's a great analogy about a wedding. If you thought about a hen party, you know, that hen is going to know she's loved and supported because she'll be given massages and words of affirmation and all the love, and she'll know she's loved 100%. For me, and maybe us, we're going to chain you to that lamppost because I love you so much. I'm going to strip you naked and chain you in the cold. Exactly. That's because I love you so much.
That's so true. But, you know, I've heard so much, and we talk a lot about male privilege and, you know, male power and all of these great things that men have in our sort of patriarchal system. But we don't really think about what they lose, you know, what they lose in that system. And I think I always was like, sexism was about sort of closing the gap between what men get and what women want. But when I had boys and when I started researching this subject, I was like, you know, boys and men get everything except for the thing that's most worth having in life, you know, which is really profound human connection. And, you know, honestly, yes, they have power. Yes, they have privilege. All of those things are real, the pay gap, all of that. But that lack of access to connection and intimacy is so harmful psychologically, and that loneliness that comes with it. And pretty much every woman I know has lots of close friends, you know, or maybe not lots, but like a couple of people that you can really be yourself with. And, you know, it's modeled to us. We have best friends all the way from the beginning. We read about friendships, female friendships in books. We see it in movies. We see it in TV programs. We see it, you know, everywhere. And I think boys are just so taught from an early age to just see human interaction as competitive, combative, you know, who's the best, winning, and let's chain our friend to the lamppost, you know.
Yeah, the statistics around it are quite terrifying. I think 1 in 4 men say they don't really have any friends, any close friends.
Yeah.
So it's, you know, it's really concerning, particularly when we know that men's mental health tends to be worse than women's. And obviously there is a link there, which leads me on to a question about the dreaded S word, screens. And, you know, I mean, I remember reading in your book, and I was thinking about it the night this happened, that you said something about what girls, I think it's a friend of yours who had a daughter, and she said the girls would come over for a sleepover and they'd all get into bed with each other and they'd all sit and like snuggle up and chat together. And I had a sleepover for one of my sons, and they all just sat and stared at a screen and played video games and didn't speak to each other. And then they were like, okay, it's bedtime. And I was like, do you not want a midnight feast? Do you not want to like run around and scream, or like, you know, all the things that I remember doing?
Yeah.
But what role do you think screens plays in this?
I think being a boy in this particular moment, there's so many different cultural forces. So it's like, there's all the old problems, which are, you know, toughen up, man up, don't express your emotions. And then there's a bunch of new problems, both sort of politically. And also then we add screens into the mix. And it's just, I think boys, there's so many sort of natural problems with boys' friendships anyway, that make it sort of harder for boys to connect with one another in that deep way. And then screens come into the mix, and it's just such an easy way to kind of avoid that kind of connection that's already really like a little fraught, a little hard. They don't really have the skills. And then, you know, the screens come in, especially video games, and it's like just a very easy alternative. So they're not building those social muscles in a way to like just hang out in person, you know, to get through that social awkwardness, to get through that anxiety, to get through like, what do we talk about? What do we do? And I think, you know, sports is another way, probably a healthier way that boys connect. But again, it's not really about talking or being face to face, and they're just like not given a chance to build those skills. But I know it's the same with my boys. Their friends will come over and they're just a bit like, well, what do we do? You know, and if I say no screens, they're like looking at each other. And you don't want to be that mum who's like the weird house where there's no screens allowed, you know, you don't want to like put your kids at a social disadvantage, but then they just don't develop those skills. And, you know, sometimes I'll say like, okay, no screens until whatever time. And they're just like, you know, and I found for myself, actually, it's sometimes about managing the discomfort in me as much as anything. It's about like managing my own feelings around it. And if I can get through it and just be like, it's okay, they're going to be okay. I have faith in them. They'll figure it out, you know, give them a few suggestions, but just sort of have faith that they can do it. Then eventually they do. But it's a real barrier and it's really hard.
So, Elliott, you very luckily have your parents close by and they do quite a bit of childcare for you, but they go to Grenada for 3 months every year. What do you do when they're gone? How do you look after yourself and your relationship?
Well, I feel very sorry for myself. Going to Grenada is amazing for them, but it's not so great for us. Luckily, we have Bubble. Bubble provides us with emergency childcare, backup childcare, and ultimately the opportunity for us to have date nights and also go to the spa every now and again. Because us parents, we need to maintain our identity. We need to maintain our self-care and our relationships. So Bubble is incredible for when my parents jet off to Grenada.
Find and book background checked nannies and sitters who can be with you in as little as an hour. Trusted by parents you know. Like us, search Bubble Childcare in the App Store or Google Play Store.
So I was reading about a parent who has a son and their son was playing with their friend down the road. They'll play online games together, Call of Duty, FIFA, whatever. And the parent was really trying to encourage their son to like socialize more and get out. So he said to him, why don't you go to your friend's house and spend time together? And his son said, well, if I did that, we wouldn't be able to play. Because their whole world existed online. They played together through online gaming.
Yes.
And the idea of them spending time together in a room was like, what do we do then?
Yeah. I mean, it's so true. I've heard like a variation of that story so many times from different parents. And it's like, it looks slightly different depending on the age group and whatever, but it's the same thing because like male social life is migrating online. And these sort of big multiplayer video games and places like Discord have just become the new male social spaces, and it's just sort of drifted that way. And I think, you know, it's really worrying. And there's lots of data that supports this idea that actually boys are spending around 5 hours more per week on screens than girls are, and about 5 hours less socializing in the real world than same age girls are, which is really scary. That's a really big difference. And so obviously the screen time debate affects everybody and all teenagers and all the rest of it. But I think we're missing out that this is quite a gendered problem. And in a way, many of the sort of, you know, the hot takes and a lot of the like discussion around screen time has focused on girls and things like social media and social comparison and online bullying. And we haven't really talked that much about what's happening with boys and the way that they're replacing real life socializing with screen-based socializing. And the more it becomes like this self-fulfilling prophecy, I think a lot of boys and a lot of the boys that I spoke to are developing almost like social anxiety around real world interactions. They just don't know how to do it. And it becomes scarier and scarier. And the more scary it becomes, the more they avoid it. And the more, the more they avoid it, the less they're able to do it. And it just becomes like a vicious circle. And similarly, with sex, real world sex and dating, and, now you've got porn, it's just this very easy way to just avoid all of the like challenges and fears and anxieties and rejections and all of the stuff that you get around, real world dating.
And there's quite a lot of harmful content as well, I find, for young men as well, in terms of ideas around dating, ideas around what you should be, and what success looks like. And sometimes I listen to this because it's interesting for my work, so I can see what's going on. And I feel like a lot of those ideas from like the red pill space are just not true in real life.
Yes.
They are not true in real life.
Yes.
But I think it's very easy for a 13, 14-year-old boy to see this content from someone who looks successful and believe you need to earn 6 figures before you approach a girl and ask them out for a date. And I think it's ridiculous that's happening. But I can see how a 13, 14-year-old young boy would believe that that's true.
Yes, and I think these kinds of masculinity influences and all the rest of it just have such a huge sway on boys now, and especially because it's a sort of vicious circle, because if they're not going out and meeting people in the real world and seeing what real life is like, and that all kinds of men get dates and all kinds of boys are successful socially and all the rest of it, they're getting these ideas online, and then that becomes, their world is narrowing, and that becomes the truth, and they feel they have to live up to that.
There is quite a bit in the book which I found really terrifying, if I'm honest, about sex and porn, consent.
Yeah.
And obviously we've talked a bit about the influence that porn is having on men's relationships with women. I know that you talk a bit in the book about strangulation, asphyxiation, and the number of boys and girls that are participating in that. But I was really surprised by some of the data that you found out, that actually it tends to be more women doing this to boys than the other way around.
Well, it's not so much that it's both. So it's that. So I think there's this whole conversation about strangulation and choking, and often there's a lot of shaming almost of boys and men in this conversation. So there's this sort of idea floating around that all these boys are like desperate to strangle and choke their girlfriends, and girls don't want it, and that they're doing that without their consent. And that does happen for sure. And it's, and it's utterly wrong that should ever happen. I'm not condoning that in any way. But the reality of the data is a lot more complex, I think. I think there are a lot of boys that really don't want to do that stuff either, that either don't want it done to them or don't want to do it to anybody else. But they feel pressure to be masculine, and they feel that that's what girls want and expect. There was actually data that showed that there were more girls who were doing it to boys than the other way around without asking for consent. And maybe that's because of our narratives of consent, this idea that boys are always up for everything. They always want everything. They always want everything sexual, and that only girls can be assaulted. And I think that's, that narrative is developed for a reason. And obviously boys are physically stronger than girls, and it is really different, a boy strangling a girl without her consent than the other way around. But I think that we're not really giving boys a good narrative where they can say, look, I don't want this. This doesn't feel good to me. I don't want to either do it to somebody else or have it done to me. I feel like that consent conversation has really only gone in one direction. And it's the most important direction, but the other direction is also important, And I think there are a lot of girls who are almost like policing boys' masculinity and expecting them to act that way, and saying, well, if he doesn't do that, he's not very masculine, he's not a real man, he's not aggressive or dominant enough. And I think boys in this moment are just so paralyzed in how to act. On the one hand, they're held to these standards of masculinity, which is like, be tough, be dominant, be aggressive, be assertive, be a real man. And, everybody's policing that. Girls are policing it, society's policing it. But on the other hand, there's this like other narrative post Me Too about consent and never overstep, never go too far. Boys are sort of predators, they're rapists. And so they're just like, oh, I can't do that. And they don't know how to act at all. So it's almost like easier to just watch porn than it is to try to have a real relationship or real sexual life with an actual human.
And boys are having less sex than they ever have been. Is that right?
Yes.
Have I got that right?
So you see the trends that are happening with like socializing and friendship, in terms of like boys are spending less time hanging out in person with friends. They're also having less sexual and romantic contact than they ever have before, or ever since researchers like started tracking back in the 70s or whatever it was. So it's this, boys are becoming more and more and more isolated, and this isn't healthy. I think boys are very scared of the consent Me Too conversation, and, getting accused of something or hurting somebody, doing something wrong. I think that this generation of boys in particular have grown up, the boys who were going through puberty when the Me Too movement kind of exploded online are now voting age, university age, and they have spent their whole adolescence in the shadow of this conversation, telling them they're toxic, they're bad, they're predators, they're rapists, And those conversations were really important. And of course, it's important for boys to know about consent. But I think there's a generation of boys who are scared stiff.
Yeah. Yeah. And your chapter, Rape Con, I found, reading it, I felt conflicted like you did. I could
Very
feel the
conflicted.
conflict as you were talking about the research that you were doing, and as you were talking to mothers of boys who'd been accused of sexual assault who were convinced that their sons hadn't done anything wrong.
Yeah.
And, as many mothers listening to this, like me, will have experienced sexual assault, will have experienced not being believed when you say a man has done something to you that was inappropriate. And so you bring that baggage to that conversation, inevitably as a woman. But I'd love you to talk a little bit about those experiences you had while researching this, particularly that conference you went to, which all of that was fascinating.
Yeah, I mean, this was far and away the hardest part of this book to write because, like you, I'm a feminist. I really want to get across the believe women message. I've had my own experiences, and most girls that I know or women that I know have had some level of experience with like sexual harassment or sexual violence or not being believed. And this was, so true, this thing. And it still is true that women will report these things and not be believed. So it's like, but there's also this new situation in which boys are being accused of things that didn't happen, or maybe, there are two very legitimate perspectives on the same event. And I was because it almost feels like in this moment, this issue is so fraught that there's only room for one story. It's either, girls are liars and they're trying to ruin men's lives, or boys are these poor victims and these terrible lying girls are saying that they're assaulting them when they're not. And actually, human relationships are so much more complicated than that. There are, of course, stories where like a boy will force a girl to do something and it's terrible and all the rest of it. But there are also many, many times when boys and girls can be in an encounter and people are not reading signals correctly, and one person will have one perspective, another person will have another perspective. Something can feel really, really bad to a girl and feel really icky and unpleasant, but still not be assault, that it's not criminal. And so I went to this conference. It was a conference for boys who'd been accused of campus sexual assault. I live in the States and this was in America. And campus sexual assault is a big problem here. And I went into this conference being like, these rapist boys, they're terrible. Why are their mothers or parents defending them? They should go to the dogs, that, no punishment is too bad for them. And the more I listened to these stories, the more I realized that these cases are just so sad. And there was no due process. They were just being expelled from university. Things were decided. And then eventually I only focused, so in that chapter, I only focused on cases which had already been settled through official procedures. So it wasn't for me as a journalist to like try and adjudicate an assault case, but these were cases where a boy had been suspended from college. His life had basically been ruined. His friends wouldn't talk to him anymore. He'd been cancelled. He was usually in a terrible, terrible depression. He would appeal the case and it would go through several rounds. And then often there would be a lawsuit and like a legal case. And it would find, after surveying all the evidence, that he had not been treated fairly, that there was no due process, that he hadn't really done anything wrong. And then it was settled and he'd get a payout usually from the university at the end. But it was just like the payout, his legal cost was so high, it would barely even cover that. His life was been ruined. He's like tarnished as a rapist. And, but as a feminist, it was so hard to report on those stories. I felt like I was almost betraying women, betraying feminism by saying this is even possible, that you're sort of saying, well, don't believe women. And that's absolutely not what I want to say at all, because that's still a really serious problem.
Mm. And I think it's so good that you've had this conversation, and you are, because I think part of the reason we haven't addressed these issues, we were talking earlier about the fact that there aren't many kind of podcasts around this. There isn't much conversation around this, just globally. And I think it is so sensitive. It is so conflicting.
So sensitive.
And it's difficult to address. But I think, thank you, first and foremost.
Thank you.
It's really good that you're bringing this to the forefront, because they are important conversations to have.
Yeah.
And I think from my perspective, when I'm working, with men, with dads to improve their lives and help them to see the world differently together, whatever that means for them, I always have to say, it's not just for the dads and the men, it's for everybody.
Yes.
It's because if we support dads to be more equal caregivers, that's better for workplace gender equality for women and the motherhood penalty, and kind of, always have to preface it with that, I guess.
Yes.
And I think it's part of the tricky conversation is talking about some of the negative experiences that men face when we have so much privilege.
Yes.
It's just difficult to bring to the forefront, but we have to, and we have to be brave.
Yeah.
And we have to put it on the table, and we have to consider and discuss.
And I think also we shouldn't see it as a zero-sum game. I think in our culture at the moment, it's like, if we talk about men, then we're sort of doing something terrible to women, or that we're like taking away from the feminist fight, or vice versa. Men are feeling it the other way around, that like women's gain is their loss. But actually this system, this idea that there's these stereotyped gender roles, that these expectations, this like patriarchal system is really harming both men and women in different ways. And I think we need to be able to have a very honest and fair conversation. And I think boys, especially, it's so new, this conversation in a way. And I think boys feel really shut down and really like, at the moment, it feels like people are only listening to girls and women. And, obviously that's to be set in the context of the entire history of oppression of women. But you can see, if you're a 15-year-old boy, you didn't do any of those bad things. You're not Harvey Weinstein. You're just like trying to live your life. And it feels like boys need to be able to have a voice to be able to talk about the issues for them as well.
Beautifully put. I'm going to just bring it back a little bit to education, just because I don't want to miss this brilliant chapter that you've written on the education system. And we know that boys are doing worse in the education system than girls are. They are in the UK, they are in the US.
Yeah.
We know that boys are much more likely to be excluded. We know that if they go into higher education, they're much more likely to drop out. I found some of the stuff you said in there that the way I had interpreted what was happening in schools. You talked a bit about some of the theories that people have and why they're not necessarily true, which I found really interesting, because you actually dispelled some of the things, the myths that were floating around in my head.
Yeah.
Could you talk a little bit about what you think's going on?
I think there's lots of different things going on, but so boys are underachieving in school compared with girls. So girls have been doing better and better and better. So it used to be that girls were held back, but as soon as those barriers to girls' achievement were taken away, since around the 80s, girls have been, gaining on boys, and now they've overtaken boys in pretty much everything at every level of schooling, from like reception through to university, postgraduate degrees, beyond. And there are lots of reasons for this. It's a really complex topic, so I don't want to oversimplify. But one of the big sort of pushes in the way that people talk about this is that the reason why boys are underachieving is because we've kind of like feminized the classroom. Like, we've made school like suitable for girls but not suitable for boys. And there's this real push to sort of go back to let boys be boys and let them be, more masculine, and, that their sort of natural interests are being squashed and all the rest of it. Now, I took issue with this idea in the chapter by saying that actually it's a lot of the times it's really the opposite thing that's going on, that the kind of masculine norms that are like, be tough, be strong, are the very things that are holding boys back in the classroom. And these stories that that studying is kind of girly and that it's feminized and that is actually the thing that's keeping boys from achieving. And also, when you talk about sort of feminine coded things like social emotional learning and like building really strong relationships in the classroom are sort of, not that those things should be feminine or masculine, they should just be human, but they're kind of coded as feminine. Those are actually the things that would probably help boys the most in the classroom, rather than going back to some like, we're all at war and what we need is more competition and what we need is more violence. Boys need, it goes back to what we were talking about at the beginning, which is boys need more nurturing. They need more emphasis on social emotional learning. They need more relationship stuff. They need more nurture. And that kind of nurturing environment, which we've coded as feminine, actually would benefit boys. And there's lots of data on this that shows that boys really benefit from, having more social emotional input.
Fascinating. I really want to get from you, because there's stuff on this in the book which I found so useful. an idea of what we can do, Ruth. I mean, help us. Like, help me. What would you say from all of the brilliant research that you've done? What are the messages you would have for the parents of boys listening?
I think people really, when I talk to people about this, what they really want is me to give them like some script that is like, these are the exact words to say to your son that will fix everything. And, obviously, I wish that were true, but it's not really true because, every child is different, every adult is different. But when I think about what solutions there are, how we can move differently, I tend to split it up into like 3 areas as like ways to think about how to interact with your son, rather than like very specific actions. But so those 3 areas are critical thinking, curiosity, and care and connection. So critical thinking, I think part of this is just naming the problem. I think that we've done a really good job with girls and women. Obviously, it's not over, but we've done a really good job of being able to call out when we see sexism. And most people, even like 11-year-old girls can usually spot when something is sexist and be like, oh, why are all the boys, getting the top jobs and the girls not? Or why is the princess being rescued by the prince? Or so I think they have a language and vocabulary to talk about it. And I think we're really behind with that when it comes to boys. They're not really able to name the problem, and it feels shameful to name it. And like, for instance, just a really small example. I don't know if you guys ever saw the film Inside Out, the Inside Out movies. So it's this.
I love Inside Out.
Yeah, so
amazing.
It's like
Inside Out 2 is even better as well.
Yeah, so it's like this brilliant film. I loved it. I took my boys to. We binge watched the whole 1, 2, and all the little shorts. And it's this wonderful film, and it's all about a girl who's got this really complex emotional life. And she's like, all her friends have a complex emotional life. Her mum has a complex emotional life. You're tracking each other's emotions, but every time a male character comes on screen in any of those movies, that person is an emotional idiot. Like, you go inside their brain and the emotions have their feet up on the desk, and they're checked out, and they're watching the football, and they're going, and they don't know what anyone else is feeling or thinking. And it was just like, if that was a stereotype about a girl in a mainstream Pixar or Disney movie or whatever, if it was a stereotype about a girl being ditzy or bad at maths or whatever, we wouldn't let it pass. And we shouldn't let it pass for boys and men with emotions. So I'm watching this with my sons and being like, how, what message are we giving them that everyone can have a complex emotional life except for them, that they're not capable of that, So I think it's just about calling these things out in popular culture, seeing them, doing the critical thinking ourselves, having these discussions about it, talking about it more and more, and just making these ideas normal currency in the culture, so that when boys feel weird about stuff, they can draw on, on these conversations. So that's the critical thinking piece. Curiosity, I think, is what we were talking about just before, that I think a lot of boys feel very shut down in this moment. They feel like girls are allowed to speak, girls are allowed to talk about their pain, that nobody's really interested. Everyone's saying, you're so privileged, you're so powerful, you have everything, time to be quiet, take up less space. And actually, when I talk to boys, they're feeling like nobody's really interested in them and what they feel and what they're going through and what they think. So, and I think, especially as feminist mums, there's this real pressure to not raise a toxic son, and to be really strict with him, and not, make sure that he's not terrible. And I think it can end up being that we're always judging and reforming our sons and trying to make them different, or imposing an agenda, and not really showing this genuine curiosity about what it's like to be them in this moment. So I think that, and the boys that I interviewed were just crying out for people to listen to them, to talk to them. And that doesn't mean accepting every sexist thing they say, but just be like, what is life like for you? I'm not trying to change you. I'm not trying to reform you. I'm just listening to you. And then the care and connection piece is, as we talked about, boys are kind of slightly under-nurtured in our culture. We tend to touch boys less. We talk to them about their emotions less. We give them, we tell them to man up. We tell them to be tough, and often, especially with teenage boys, we let them kind of go off into their rooms and just, disassociate a little bit. And I think the only way we can reach them, and the only way that we can teach them to care about other people, is to build the best possible relationship with them that we can. So meet them where they are, advocate for them, make them feel loved, give them a lot of hugs and touch and positive care, make them feel like we're on their side, and just build the very best relationship you can as your authentic self with the specific child that you have. And it sounds obvious, and it shouldn't, and it should be obvious, but it kind of isn't. I think boys, there's a stereotype of the boy mom being like this, like overindulging, but actually really kind of the opposite is true. And I think we just need to build that very caring, very nurturing relationship with our son so that we model that, and then he can bring that to other people too.
Love that. That is brilliant. Thank you.
Thank you.
Look, everybody, buy this book. Buy this book. It's so good. It's so good. And Ruth, where can people find you besides obviously buying the book, which everybody should do?
Well, thank you. Yeah, so a book, obviously. I'm on Instagram, Ruth Whippman. It's 2 P's in the middle. And I write a Substack called I Blame Society. So if you're on Substack, come and find me. And I run a monthly discussion group about these issues, about boys, about men, masculinity. And it's always really interesting. People have great things to talk about. And I write about this subject on there as well. So, on Substack and Instagram.
And Ruth, you said something which is going to stick with me. You said lots of men and boys have everything apart from the one that's most important. That's human connection.
Yeah.
And I think the way you've said that is incredible. And I think it sums up a lot of what we're trying to do with this podcast. So yeah, just thank you. Thank you so much. I've loved this conversation.
It's been such a pleasure talking with you both. Thank you.
Thank you.